Thank you for listening to this week's lecture, which covers our reading from Chapter 10, Placement, Customer Value Fulfillment, and we are in week 9 of our semester already. So our online quiz for week 9 covers Chapter 10, and it opened at 9 a.m. This morning on Monday, and again it has the 2-week time frame and closes at 10 p.m. on Monday, the 8th of October, just the 2 weeks later. Just a heads up that the week 7 quiz closes today at 10 p.m. on stream. Also a heads up that our next fortnightly workshops will be held during week 10 to complete our last fortnightly exercise, and that will be covering a Vodafone case study. I'll be talking more about that exercise over the next week in our class. And also, it's not on the slide, but we are in the process of finishing up the midterm tests, and I will have feedback for you early next week, which is week 10 in our class, about, first of all, the overall strengths and weaknesses of how the class did, and also we'll talk about responses for each of the questions. In other words, I'll talk about what were correct responses and that will help you study for your final exam, which is on the Monday, the 5th of November at 9:15. Incidentally, I will be talking about. So looking ahead to the next slide, our guiding questions, just like every week, I always structure every week around overall guiding questions to help you really draw the material together and focus our material in the textbook together, which covers quite a bit. So first of all, we're looking at what is the nature of supply chain management? Secondly, how do marketing channels add value? Thirdly, what is the nature of marketing channels? And how are marketing channels organized to create value? Thirdly, what are major themes in retailing, retailers' marketing decisions, and retailing trends and development? And fifthly, what are major issues that guide wholesalers' marketing decisions, and what are major wholesaling trends? So these questions will help you prepare for our quiz over this chapter over the coming and also weeks. Our final exam. The next slide, slide 3, covers learning objectives that our quiz is structured around especially, and also the key terms from which these objectives are coming from. Just a heads up on these key terms, I realized that if we were going to compile the list of key terms together in our class, it would be overwhelming. You would have a very long list of key terms. So one of my goals for your final exam is I'm really going to help you focus down on the overall important terms that will help you prepare for the final exam. You will see the questions beforehand, but you won't know what questions from the list will be on the final exam. And so our last workshop, which is on week 12, will be really focusing on that very hard and helping you get ready for how to answer those kinds of questions. So looking ahead at slide number 5, the supply chain. So our whole chapter is really based around this idea of what is a supply chain. So think for a moment about the products that you see on the shelves at companies. So a supply chain is defined as a series of activities that's involved in designing and producing and marketing and delivering any product that you see in any shop, any place that you would go to consume or buy the product. And so the supply chain, what it is, it's a perspective or a way of looking at how companies deliver value to their customers. Now remember, that idea of delivering value is really central to our course. And each link in the supply chain has the potential to add or remove value from the product that you and I, the customer, eventually buys. And we'll talk about what these links are, and just remember that idea of value, that just delivering value to customer. That actually goes back to the marketing process that was laid out in chapter 1, which was also one of the questions. Looking ahead at the next slide, slide 6, supply chains and the value delivery network. It's important to realize that supply chains are a network, and it really is. Supply chains are a system that effectively produce, and they're systems that help get the products, make the products, and get the products to the end users, which are you and I. And so supply chain management is all of the activities, tasks involved in managing like the upstream and the downstream value-added flow of materials. So the final goods and related information among the suppliers, the company, the resellers, or in other words, the shops that sell the products to the final consumers, And supply chains also include the marketing aspect of this whole process. So marketing logistics, as our textbook puts it. So marketing logistics are all the tasks involved in planning and implementing, controlling just the flow of materials from and the final goods from the point of origin to the point of use to meet the needs of consumers at a profit. Let me put this in everyday language because I realize this is coming from the textbook and it can be a little hard to understand. So, excuse me, imagine you might have a pair of shoes that you're purchasing. So I go running quite a bit. And so I buy New Balance shoes are my preferred brands. And so the marketing and logistics would be all of the tasks involved in the planning and controlling the flow of materials, like all the materials used to make those running shoes from the point of origin, so wherever the materials, the rubber or whatever materials are sourced to create the shoes, from the point of origin where they're manufactured to the point of use, and what that involves is the whole process of getting to the shop, delivering to the shop, getting to the shop, and then me, the consumer that is purchasing those shoes, and hopefully I'm purchasing them at a profit to the reseller. So your last problem-solving exercise looked at the idea of markup profit that resellers put on products that they buy for the cost price at cost from the wholesaler, and then they sell them for the selling price at a markup in order to make a profit. So with slide number 7, the supply chain decisions really are among the most important decisions that face people who are working in this area. So people in this area, maybe some of you might even go into this type of marketing career. Like you have to decide whether or not you're going to use sole source operations, where you're going to locate the plants in order to make the products that you're trying to sell. You're scheduling decisions, whether you supply from the production or just you want to inventory the product. You have a lot of decisions to make. Now, if we had had our lecture in person, I would have shared with you a story where I had the opportunity to tour one of the Countdown distribution centers that's near the airport in Auckland. And there's a number of Countdown distribution centers around the country. And it was absolutely fascinating to see the distribution center in Auckland. First of all, it's very high tech. So it's a LEED building, LEED certified building. So it is as energy efficient as possible. Secondly, let me try to put this picture for you. You walk in and it's just a huge warehouse, really tall shelves. I mean, tall as the ceiling. And there were robots that were gathering the items from the shelf to supply the resellers, which were all the Countdowns in the area. And it was also fascinating to see where the products came in from. I was very surprised to learn that a lot of the products are not made in Australia, which I thought they were because of connection to Woolworths, but they're actually coming from China and other countries, but primarily from China. So if you were in supply chain management, you'd have to decide whether you're going to supply from producing the item, how to manage the materials as well, because as our textbook mentioned, you don't want to have an overstock of materials lying around in the warehouse, but you have to have smooth selling at all times. And we have covered that previously in our class when we talked about perishability as a service characteristic. So the next slide, in slide 8, is a really nice graphic from our textbook that lays out supply chain management. I'm not going to go over this in detail, but as I mentioned before a midterm test, you just want to look at these types of graphics that we have in our textbook and just be aware of all of the different aspects of these processes. So supply chain for a typical grocery product from its point of origin, like looking at the left-hand side, the creation of it, the assembling, packing it, distributing it, the agents and brokers, you have the retailer, and then finally the end user. And I really encourage you to look over any types of infographics that you look for because they will really help you prepare for the final exam. They're also great. Now the next slide, in slide 9, is another great example of that. It's another infographic that's coming from our textbook. And what it does is it breaks down the supply chain management process in a little bit more detail. And it looks at the different components of each of the parts of that supply chain. So the raw materials, the different kinds of materials that would be used to create the products. You have the parts suppliers, so the other parts that are going into creating the plier. You have the manufacturer, whatever the company is that's actually creating the product. Like, for example, my father worked at Goodyear Tire Company, so he worked for the manufacturer, but the raw materials the rubber and other steel and other parts would be coming in from other places. And he also had equipment coming in from parts suppliers. And then he worked at the manufacturer, and in turn, they would send the tires out to retailers and then finally to the consumers, which at that time were mostly in the 70s and 80s were mostly at Goodyear dealers. And there is one here in Lower Hutt. And I was talking with the person that worked there a few months ago, and he said, yes, a lot of the supply does come from the factory where my father worked. So looking at slide number 10, the goals of the supply chain, really a big concept throughout our entire class is that these processes want to add value. As I've mentioned several times in our class, companies want to maximize their efforts and they want to maximize their profits. So a supply chain will try, ideally, add value through the following decisions or activities that happen in this whole process that we've been talking about. So it could be, for example, in purchasing decisions, could be warehouse number and cost, like trying to manage the stock that's in warehouses, not getting too much information or materials that are just sitting there not being used. Also, the types of transport that's being used. I'm sure that you probably heard in the news that there's coming soon are going to be driverless trucks, for example, smart trucks. And so that's another way that companies are trying to save money for, definitely has some negatives because a lot of people will be out of jobs. But what this chart on the right-hand side of slide 10 is trying to get at are all the different ways that companies try to be as efficient as possible in these different areas. I encourage you to look at our textbook and to read about these different areas and to see why efficiency is so important, and efficiency and also the smartest way of maximizing their effort. So slide 11 talks about the main functions of supply chain management. So supply chain management includes different parts of this whole process. So you have the warehouse where stocks are being held. That'd be like the Countdown warehouse that I visited in Auckland. Also, you have the inventory management. There are people who are really expert in managing the amount of materials that go in and out of inventory. And I can tell you from my own experience of visiting different warehouses that it is a very skilled job, that they have to know how to anticipate inventory that's coming in. They have to know exactly what's on the shelf. And these are massive warehouses. I mean, think, for example, Amazon. Think about their different distribution centers that they have around the world, and think about how they have to manage their inventory. And think about if you've ever ordered from Amazon, how quickly your item has come. Like when I lived in the US, things would literally come the next day, and they would have to have excellent inventory management to be able to do that and to match the nearest warehouse to wherever I was living at the time. Also, the idea of transportation and the logistics of delivering the product to the people is really important to the consumer. And then managing the information. So that's information about the inventory, invitation about the marketing. And we will, we will especially be getting into that in the last few weeks of our class, where we are going to be talking more about that aspect of the marketing mix. That little graph that you see on the left-hand side in slide 11 is just a replication from our textbook, which looks at just the placement of products. And I like to put in infographics from our textbook because they do a really nice job of giving an overview of these different products or processes. I find warehousing really fascinating, and slide 12 really gets into that. If any of you have ever been into a warehouse, you probably saw that it's a very complex operation. And a company that has warehouses to store their products for distribution has some really important decisions to make. How many warehouses are they going to have? What type of warehouses? Where are they going to locate them? Amazon's a great example of this. I mean, think about all the warehouses that they have in the different countries where they operate. They have to decide how to maximize their efforts. And having warehouses close to certain areas where they might have a lot of customers. And these are really key decisions that a company has to make in order to maximize costs
and to add
and to be as
value
efficient
at
as
all
possible
parts
of the process. And this really relates really well to the idea of inventory in this part of the supply chain management. So looking at slide number 13, marketers are always looking for new ways to make inventory management more efficient. Now, as we've gone through this lecture so far, there's several key words that have come up: value and efficiency. They actually come up quite often in our textbook. And you always want to think about, especially as you're preparing for the final exam, what are different ways that companies try to improve efficiency. This especially happens with inventory, that the slide here lists a couple different ways that companies try to be efficient. For example, radio, like RFID tags, which my husband and I were just talking about this past weekend, to try to identify the products and to know the flow, help them understand the flow of the products. Also, JIT linguist networks are very important. Transportation is such an important part of the supply chain management process. That's looking at slide number 14. So think about all the different modes of transport that exist. You know, everything from cargo planes to the internet to pipelines, the railroads, and think about intermodal transport. So what that concept means are when more than one mode of transport works together to deliver the product. And so that slide on slide number 14 on that bottom left-hand side talks about concepts such as train ship, where you might have trains and sea carriers working together. And I encourage you to look at the textbook in that section, which lists the different intermodal transports. And you can't discount information management. And the slide number 15 does a really nice job of talking about overall ways that companies manage their information, to manage their inventory, and to deliver the product from the source of origin to the final end user. The most widely used method of information management is EDI, as our chapter also discusses it in its section. But other methods, such as vendor managed inventory systems, I really encourage you to read up on those. And think about, as you read these sections in the textbook, what products do you use? And what kinds of information management methods might the companies be using? And then you can't discount the idea of the nature of marketing channels. And so looking at slide number 16, what we're going to do now is actually turn to the idea of what is a marketing channel or a distribution channel. So the best way I know how to describe a marketing channel is that it's a network of interdependent organizations, like intermediaries, that are involved in this process of making goods and services available for use or consumption by the consumer or the business user. So think about the different products that you use. Think about foods that you eat. Like think, for example, restaurants that you might go to. And think about all the different organizations that are all connected to each other. Because in other words, they rely on each other to make that food be available to you as the end user. Like I'll give you an example. So when I was a professor in the U.S., a lot of institutions, tertiary institutions in the U.S., students live in residence. So in other words, they live on campus. And so they eat in refectories. And I remember, especially at night, because I lived really close to campus, driving through, going to my office usually to pick up something, and I would see like the food warehouse trucks stopped outside of their refectories delivering the food for the next few days. And it made me realize how these refectories had people that managed the inventory, but the fact that there was intermediaries that were involved in making sure that all the products used to make the food were available to you. Now, the next slide, slide 17, is also coming from our textbook. And all it is it's looking at the different ways that a distributor reduces the number of channel transactions. And I'm not going to go through this in detail, but go back to the section of our book where it lists this infographic. And what it does is it looks at the different possibilities for ways that channels can be organized in order to get the product to the end user more efficiently. And there's different connections that happen. Looking at slide number 18, the nature of marketing channels. This is coming once again to this whole idea of adding value. Channel members add value by performing a variety of functions. So think about what a channel is that we just talked about, and think about all the intermediaries that exist along the way. So intermediaries, they can provide information, they can help promote the product, they can, an intermediary can help a company find prospective buyers for the product. They can match, they can shape the product to meet the right retailer. They can help with negotiation on the price and terms. I mean, think about the egg study that you just worked on for the last fortnightly exercise. You saw an example with one of those questions about how eggs, like a reseller or a shop like Countdown, bought the eggs at cost from the warehouse, and then they resold them to the end user. And so an intermediary would be involved in that negotiation of trying to reach an agreement on the price and the terms between the producer and the reseller or the grocery store. Also, you have intermediaries that help with transporting the goods from the source to the end user. Also in financing this whole operation to cover, I mean, this is hugely expensive work running these channels. And then so managing lengths actually differ in how long they are, and that's looking at slide 19. So you can see here there's different replications of lengths of different channels. Each channel can have a different number of intermediary, and I really encourage you to look at how these channels can be organized and how you can have like a one-level channel where you have like, for example, the manufacturer and then the consumer on the other end and just one intermediary in the middle of it. Or you might have a two-level channel where you have several intermediaries involved from the manufacturer to the consumer. And so the channel length, all it does is it refers to the number of intermediary levels that you have between the manufacturer and the consumer. It's going to differ. So looking at slide number 20, the nature of marketing channels, again, this is getting at this whole idea of how you have a producer and a consumer, or a manufacturer and a consumer, and then the number of intermediaries that you have in between and what they do in that process. Each intermediary is going to have different. One is another example of this, where you have a producer to an end user, and look at all the different types of intermediaries that exist that help and do their part to get the product number 22. It's just looking at different types of products. And that's what I want to draw your attention to with these different products, is each type of product is going to have a different number of intermediaries, and they're going to do different tasks. It's going to depend on the product and the nature of the consumer, the nature of the producer. So really get a sense of this as you're reading. Channels differ in their complexity. So slide 23 looks at how the channels can differ. And again, you're getting that channel length between manufacturer and then to the consumer. And you'll see that the little graphs that you see, like product flow, over ownership flow, information flow, and promotion flow, get at the different tasks that these different channel members are doing. So channels can become very complex, is really one of the main points of this chapter. And it really depends on the product that's being sold and how complex the product is, you know, where it's going. Is it a global product? And also the variety of flows between channel behavior. There can be conflict that happens, and this is looking at slide number 24, between the different intermediaries in a channel. So channel members, they definitely cannot agree about goals and their what they're trying to get out of the situation, what their tasks or their roles are. And the chart that you see here, horizontal conflict occurs when you have conflict between two intermediaries at the same level, or you might have intermediaries that exist at different levels of the process, and I really encourage you as well to go back to that part of the chapter that talks about these different types of conflict. But the main thing to really get out of this information is to realize that when a product comes from the manufacturer to you, the consumer, that it goes through a process, that each of these players or intermediaries in the process all have tasks that they do to help the product get from the manufacturer to you and the consumer. And to realize that this process does not always go smoothly because, again, like these intermediaries, they're companies, they're made up of people, and people often don't have the same ideas. We'll get into this more in our next chapter, but there can be miscommunication that happens in this situation. And if you've studied organizational communication, you can realize you have different personalities, different goals. And so you can see if you're dealing with people, you're going to have conflicts between the people that make up. I want to talk for a moment about the nature of marketing channels. That was slide number 25. So a marketing channel or distribution channel, it's a network of interdependent organizations or intermediaries that are involved in this process of making goods and services that are available and made by the consumer and made available for your consumption. And so it could be for the consumer. Like the latter part of our chapter talks about different trends in channel organization, like key trends. And, definitely, as I'm sure a lot of you are already aware of, is online marketing. I'm very similar to a lot of you in that I buy most of the products that I buy are actually online. I buy from Amazon and Trade Me, and also another company called iHerb based in the US. And direct marketing, probably not a whole lot as much as online marketing. But the thing is that online marketing or the internet is just dramatically changing the way that companies operate. And it's changing these distribution channels. And it's also changing our expectations of what we want from, for example, length of time. So I really wanted to point your attention to looking at slide number 27, where you have, like a situation like disintermediation, trends in channel organization. And I really like in this slide how it has a replication of the process of, the consumer who is looking to purchase, to purchase a trip. They go to a travel agent, they get their. So this is going ahead to the next slide, which is slide 31. Really what our chapter comes back down to as an overall idea is that the goal of any supply chain really is to provide a targeted level of customer service efficiently. And there's that word efficiently coming up again. So a company must first research the importance of various distribution services to customers and then set the desired service levels for each segment. So don't forget about the idea that companies, when they are surveying the marketplace, they are trying to target key segments of the population who they think will be ideal customers or would be interested in their product. And so when companies are trying to get their product out to consumers, they don't forget about those base segments that they've identified, but they're trying to reach them in a very efficient way, in a way that brings value to the customer, and also customers or segments of the population that they hope will be interested in their product, whether that's demographic segments, geographic segments. So what we've looked about this today overall, this is coming from our guiding questions, looking at slide 32, is that we've looked at the nature of supply chain management. We've also talked about marketing channels and how they can add value. And our lecture also covered the nature of marketing channels and how marketing channels are organized to create value. So this class really has examined major themes in retailing. Look at that last part of that chapter where it really talks about trends in retailing and development and also retailers' marketing decisions. And finally, we've looked at major issues that guide wholesalers' types of questions. Just the remaining slides, as always, I always have a list of suggested resources that I've presented in the lecture for this week. So as always, any questions, just let me know. We're working on your midterm exams. We'll have those marks back to you early next week. And also your problem-solving exercise on the egg studies. We're almost finished with them, and those will be back to you as well by early next week. So any questions, just let me know, and I hope you have a great week. Thanks. To learn more about the information